agave. Okay, I hate to burst your bubble on agave. So, when I was doing my master's degree in agroecology is like the intersection of agriculture, ecology, economics, and social sciences, trying to look at the whole agricultural system holistically as what's called a whole-on, which is both a part and a whole at the same time. And the fundamental question we were trying to get at with this whole degree program is, why do farmers do what they do? And how can we use that information to alter how they work with the environment, seeing as how so much of the world is covered in agricultural land. So we had this visiting scientist come from Oaxaca, Mexico, and he studies agave production. And he told us a story about how a lot of farmers are having a tough time making money just growing regular crops on their land. So they entered into contracts with agave producers. Now, the agave plant takes about 8 years to grow. It's not just like an annual crop that you can harvest all the time. You have to plant it, wait 8 years, then you get one huge harvest all at once. And then you have to drastically rework the soil if you want to plant it again. The agave plant it's pretty big. You know, this guy's like standing on it, and it's like, you know, it's up to his knee. It's got this really large root structure underground, so if you wanted to go back in and then plant crops, you'd first have to go and rip out all of these roots. And so a lot of these farmers entered into these contracts to grow agave all at the same time. And during that time when the agave was being grown, they were not allowed to enter their land, they were not allowed to use the land to grow subsistence crops, so they had to find other ways of bringing in money for crops. They got some annual rental, you know, money in return, but the primary payoff came at the time of harvest. They would get a percentage of the sales. Well, if you know anything about economics, if all of a sudden you have a whole bunch of the stuff readily available on the market at once, it's going to drive down the price. So maybe at the time they entered into the contract, the price of agave was really high, but if all of the crop comes ripe in the same year or the same couple of years, it drives down the price, and so they don't get the original amount of money they thought they were going to get. It's one bad thing. Another bad thing is a lot of the times, if you could see, this land is sloped, right? A lot of the times the agave was grown in rows down the slope rather than perpendicular to the slope. And the reason that's not good is that over time, as rain falls and things wash down, it creates these channels that literally wash the topsoil in channels down to the bottom of the land. Sloped land generally is not that great for growing crops on to begin with, but if that's the only cropland that you've got, you need to do things in order to protect your topsoil. And the reason that it was grown this way in lines down the hillside rather than perpendicular is so that the one day when it comes to harvest and you harvest these balls, this is the part that they make tequila and nectar out of, you could roll the balls down the hill. Yeah. I mean, this looks like backbreaking labor. I don't blame the guy, right? He has to go out there, and these things are spiky as all hell, and you know, he has to use this tool and like hack off the leaves to get these balls in the hot beating sun in Mexico. And I understand why he doesn't want to have to carry these things down the hill and he wants to just roll them. But then the farmer gets his land back, right? And it's full of roots that he has to dig up, and a lot of his topsoil has been washed away. And the land has generally become unsuitable for growing other kinds of crops. And he didn't get the money that he thought he was going to get. And yes, no animals were harmed in the making of this agave, except the humans, which our animals do, and which I personally, as a vegan, consider to be part of the protected species that I don't want to harm in my food and life choices. So, does that mean as a vegan you shouldn't eat agave nectar? I don't care. Do whatever you want. I really don't care. But know what goes on in the production of your food is all I'm saying. The more educated that you get, the better choices that you can make, the better off we'll all be. Okay, so does that leave us with sweet nothing? I've ruined the sweeteners for you, right? Not sugar, not molasses, not other sugar byproducts, not agave, then what the heck are we going to have? We can all have maple syrup. Wouldn't that be awesome? Man, that's expensive, right? As far as I know, there aren't like huge environmental problems with maple syrup extraction, except that, you know, when there's a bad year and there isn't a heck of a lot of it, the stuff's like $16 for like a little bottle. So, all right, I mean, there are sugar alternatives. Artificial sweeteners are not very good for your health, and there can be problems environmentally with the production of artificial sweeteners. Does anyone in here know what stevia is? Yeah, it's awesome. They have sodas out there, I think, as free samples that are sweetened with stevia. It is a plant extract. You can actually buy stevia plants. I have one at home. It's 0 calories as a sweetener. It was only recently approved for use in the United States because they said, oh, it's untested, it's not safe, blah, 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 blah. But I have a very good friend from Bolivia who's been eating it his whole life. He's like, of course, everyone and their mothers eats stevia in Bolivia. We have been eating it for hundreds of years and we've never had any problems. I eat it. I think it's great. Whatever. Give it a try. But, you know, okay, so maybe you do actually want a sweetener, okay? Now we get to the real conundrum. Honey. Well, it's not vegan because it comes from an animal, of course. All right. If honey isn't vegan, then why is it that the fruits and the nuts that we get from pollination are vegan? If you know anything about commercial agriculture, and I spent a year living in the San Joaquin Valley of California, which is full of citrus trees, almond trees, stone fruits like apricots, peaches, plums, pome fruits like apples, pears, you know, cherry production, walnuts, everything. Everywhere I went, there were bee boxes set out in fields to ensure adequate pollination of these gigantic fields of things like almonds. And I remember I was driving to one of the communities I was working with. I was a volunteer with AmeriCorps, working with low-income farm worker communities to get potable water and properly sized and functional sewer systems. Glamorous work, let me tell you. And I would drive down roads cut through almond orchards. And my windshield would literally be splattered with green goop from the bellies of bees. Because when bees only pollinate almond orchards, the honey that they collect is this bizarre green, and apparently it tastes awful and they can't even sell it. So the reason the honey exists is really just a byproduct of almond production, squash production, strawberries, anything with a big showy and or fragrant flower that's grown at the commercial scale uses bees. And the honey is really just like, here's all this crap they produced, why don't we just sell it? And I'm not even kidding. And you know, if you talk to any kind of a beekeeper, they'll tell you their primary, I mean a large-scale beekeeper, I don't mean a local beekeeper, their primary method of bringing in money is not selling honey. It's pollination fees. It's driving their bee colonies all over the country in huge trucks to pollinate whatever happens to be in season. You know, everything from berries up to tree fruits. So, yeah, I can't help but pose the question, why is it that the almonds are vegan, but the honey's not? You could say, oh, well, it directly comes out of the animal. Okay, we wouldn't have the almonds if it wasn't for the bees. And, yeah, I don't know. I could go on, and I've had huge arguments with people about this. But I could say this. You can locally source honey. I don't know of any really horrendous negative environmental impacts from the production, especially of locally sourced honey, like right here in Madison. It's nowhere near as expensive as maple syrup. It's not artificial. It's definitely cheaper than stevia, although it does have calories. And if you'd eat the strawberries, why wouldn't you eat the honey? So, just as a reflection, I just want to say that, to go back again to my first point, there are lots of studies, lots of assessments that say that, woohoo, vegan, it's like the easiest, most immediate thing you can do to drastically reduce your environmental footprint on a whole bunch of scales, especially as a person who lives in the United States, right? So, great on greenhouse gas emissions, great on water footprint, great on reducing nitrogen and phosphorus, emissions and reducing hypoxic zones and all of these kinds of wonderful things. But it's no panacea. It's not, oh, I went vegan, therefore I'm done. If you really care about the environment, if you really want to walk the talk, you got to do more. And you gotta learn, you gotta educate yourself, because I have heard very well-intended vegan people go off on beekeepers about honey, and the beekeepers are like, what are you talking about? Like, where did you get this information? Because it's nonsense. And then personally, I don't like that, because then they meet me and they're like, oh, you're vegan, you must be an idiot. Because I was accosted by someone else who had no idea what they were talking about. So educate yourself, learn, fight with me all you want. I've been studying this stuff like my whole life, so I welcome it. And like I said, I don't claim to have all the answers, but I hope I have made you guys think a little bit more, given you something new to think about. So, any questions? Yeah, so, I mean, part of the reason manure is applied to fields is because what the heck else are you going to do with it? Manure is full of nitrogen, full of phosphorus, and if you don't, one of the best things you can do with it to make sure that that nitrogen and phosphorus doesn't leach inappropriately into lakes, rivers, and streams is to apply it at the proper time and incorporate it into agricultural soils to return those nutrients to the soil and hopefully not have them run off the fields. Okay, great. We all wish that those animals that made that manure didn't even exist, but they do. So we need to do something with their manure so that the nitrogen and the phosphorus doesn't end up in the Mississippi and go make a hypoxic zone that literally kills everything. So Earth Balance is a vegan buttery spread, and it uses palm oil, but they source sustainably produced, non-orangutan harming palm oil. And some people badger them about that on their forums. Their like recipe website is called May Just Right, and people just go on there and post and go off on them about palm oil, and they say we source sustainable palm oil, and there are certifications, and the certifications involve audits and life cycle assessments and actual farm visits to see that they're not sourcing the palm oil from these regions of the world. There are other places in the world to grow palm oil other than orangutan habitat, and they go to great pains and expense, and that's one of the reasons that the palm oil they use is more expensive than the palm oil in like cheap cookies or something like that. So yes, Earth Balance, as far as I can tell from my research, uses palm oil that does not negatively impact orangutan habitat. Is palmate related to palm oil? I think palmate is a term that just describes the form in which the vitamin is, like the chemical form. It's a palmate. So the question is, what about anaerobic digestion of manure as a potential solution to all the problems with dairy manure? And problems with dairy manure are not just nitrogen and phosphorus leaching, but also odor problems and germ problems, E. coli problems, things like that. So in a digester, you take a bunch of manure, and there are fancy ways to do it and easy ways to do it. So you could just like literally throw a tent over it and let the bacteria do their thing on the carbon that's in the manure, and they produce methane. It's a dirty methane. If you wanted to be able to clean it up to natural gas like pipeline level, you'd have to do a lot of stuff to remove sulfur. Otherwise, you could just burn it on farm to produce process heat and power, to like heat dairy barns and like do all this kind of thing and basically produce a renewable energy. And this is one of the things that like is such a conundrum to me, is like, what if across the country we rolled out lots of anaerobic digesters, which would be really good from a water quality standpoint in reducing the hypoxic zone, but then if you introduce into the general natural gas system all this natural gas that was produced from the digestion of manure that came from animals, is that vegan? I don't know, but anaerobic digestion in general, I believe, is a very good idea. It's a very good way to deal with yucky, nasty stuff that we don't want leaching into water, especially if the amount of manure produced is in excess of what could possibly be land applied. And what you're left with after that, after you take all the carbon out, is much more concentrated nutrients that can be applied more effectively. And that was actually something I studied in my master's thesis with Wisconsin corn grain ethanol, is take the corn grain, turn it into ethanol. A byproduct of ethanol production is distillers' grains. You feed those to dairy cows somewhere close by so they don't have to be dried using natural gas. Then you take the manure from the dairy animals, digest it, make natural gas, feed that back to the ethanol plant to displace petroleum-based natural gas, fossil natural gas, and then return the digested manure to the field that you use to grow the corn to keep it all in a closed loop and reduce greenhouse gas emissions and reduce nutrient loss and reduce the overall use of fossil fuels in general, which would be great, but it involves animals. So when you move manure to try to get it to a digester, you're moving water, which is incredibly inefficient. And actually, one of the students who was a student of my master's thesis advisor before me did a study about at what distance, what radius of moving manure does it become economically not feasible anymore because it's too expensive, and it was 3 miles, which is not very far when you're talking about agricultural land. That's not to say, though, that you can't have small-scale digesters. Like I said, you could have a very simple digester that's like literally a lined pit with a big tent over it, and then you pull the gas off dirty and burn it. Dirty, when I say dirty, I mean with sulfur, not like literally like with some sort of toxic stuff. But yeah, if you had a concentrated animal feeding operation and you could take all of that manure, which would be a heck of a lot more, and you put in a much more sophisticated system with agitators and heaters, and you add specific microbial cocktails that maximize, you know, methane production, you'd get a lot more methane concentrated. It would be much more economically feasible. That's all true. Does that mean I want there to be CAFOs? No, I don't want there to be CAFOs. But I'm not stupid. I accept the fact that there are CAFOs and they produce a hell of a lot of manure, and if we could do something to make sure that that manure didn't pollute waterways and kill fish, I'm for that. It's hard. It's really hard. Well, I mean, there are all kinds of problems with algae. Algae use a lot of water. Algae for biofuels, you'd need a lot of land, you need a lot of water. Maybe, but then there's the whole social aspect of getting people to eat algae. Is stevia grown any more sustainably than regular sugar? And I would say that the production of stevia does not involve things like mass burning, which, I also meant to mention, releases particulates and volatile organic compounds into the air, which is bad for humans and other animals to breathe in and all of this kind of thing. It's not grown on anywhere near the level of a massive scale as sugarcane is. So at the current scale that it is produced, as far as I know, in how it is produced, it is not as environmentally damaging as sugarcane. But let's say everyone in the world starts consuming stevia at the level that they consume sugar today, it could be. There could be, you know, scale-up factors that, now we have to do all these horrible things, and, you know, it could. But as an alternative that is available today, I would say that it is environmentally preferable. Right, so in the bee boxes are levels upon levels of pre-made honeycombs. And bees will generally just fill up as many honeycombs as they have. They'll just keep filling them and filling them as long as they have flowers to pollinate. And to harvest the honey, they literally slide out the full tray, slide in an empty tray, and then go take the full tray to a processing facility to pull the honey out and separate it from waxy bits and clarify it and all that kind of stuff. Unless you buy raw honey, in which case they don't do that. Yes, there are things that you can read about how many bees are killed during this process, how when they eat nothing but almonds, their diet becomes deficient, you know, in certain nutrients and they need to be supplemented. And, you know, what they should be eating is honey from many different flowers. And yes, that is all true. That is all true. And I mean, we could talk about colony collapse disorder. We could talk about, you know, should they be eating protein supplements, all this kind of thing. I personally do not buy commercial honey. I would never buy commercial honey. I buy sometimes honey from the farmer's market, from farmers that I talk to, and they tell me about the fields that the boxes were set out in, and often it's like a clover field. It's not even, you know, necessarily pollinating fruits or vegetables or whatever. So I would say that Small-scale beekeepers go to great pains to make sure that their bees are not harmed during the production of honey because, just to put it in an economic sense, bees are expensive. And if you mess up your beehive and you have to go and replace it, that costs a lot of money and that's not good business. So what do I think of common vegan foods that are like soy-based veggie burgers and stuff like that? My personal philosophy is I went vegan because I don't like meat and stuff. So I don't really like those things. I never have. And soybean production is not good for the environment either. I will say that a lot of vegan soy-based products are generally organic. A lot of soy milks and things like that, they're usually organic. Most tofu's usually organic, some of them aren't. And organic production, I believe, having been an organic farmer, is less environmentally damaging than conventional. Certainly soybean production can be, you know, they use a lot of pesticides and fertilizers and things like that. And there's all kinds of things you could talk about with soy, but I try to make sure that my sole protein source is not soy. That, you know, it comes from lots of things, a well-balanced whole foods approach and eating food that looks like food rather than looks like a piece of chicken. It just weirds me out. GMOs, okay, so what's interesting about GMOs is from an environmental standpoint, if you could genetically introduce a trait that makes a plant produce its own pesticide so that you don't even have to apply pesticide, from an environmental standpoint, that's actually good. Of course, we need to test and figure out, could this trait escape? If it did, or if it mutated, what are the environmental consequences of that? You know, what are the consequences of consuming large quantities of these kinds of foods, and all of these kinds of things. So from that standpoint, I would say it needs a heck of a lot of research, but I am generally for things that we could do with science that would reduce the amount of pesticides we apply to the environment, because there are all kinds of problems with pesticides. How do I feel about children and women consuming soy? I think if you eat too much of anything, it's bad. Anything. What level is too much when it comes to soy? I don't know. I'm not a nutritionist. I'm not a human biologist. I don't think that if you eat tons of soy, it's necessarily bad for you. I don't know. That's a tough one, and I would say go and do lots of research, but be careful and examine your sources. Because I see all kinds of crazy propagandist nonsense about soy, like, oh, if you're a guy and you eat too much soy, literally your testicles are going to shrink, is what I've read, right? And I don't think that's true. I really don't. Or you're going to start acting like a woman and growing breasts. No. There are estrogen-like compounds in soy, yes, but you're eating it. You're not like slathering your skin with it, I don't know. It's hard to explain, but I think there's a lot of misinformation about that. So, okay, well, I want to thank you all for coming out and being a great audience, and if you want to talk to me further, I'll be at the book table, and we have another a whole set of speakers coming up, and enjoy the day, and you're all wonderful, and thanks for coming. A lot of farmers are having a tough time making money just growing regular crops on their land. So they entered into contracts with agave producers. Now, the agave plant takes about 8 years to grow. It's not just like an annual crop that you can harvest all the time. You have to plant it, wait 8 years, then you get one huge harvest all at once. And then you have to drastically rework the soil if you want to plant it again. The agave plant it's pretty big. Agave. Okay, I hate to burst your bubble on agave. So, when I was doing my master's degree in agroecology is like the intersection of agriculture, ecology, economics, and social sciences, trying to look at the whole agricultural system holistically as what's called a whole-on, bringing in money for crops. They got some annual rental money in return, but the primary payoff came at the time of harvest. They would get a percentage of the sales. Well, if you know anything about economics, if all of a sudden you have a whole bunch of the stuff readily available on the market at once, it's going to drive down the price. So maybe at the time they entered into the contract, the price of agave was really high, but if all of which is both a part and a whole at the same time. And the fundamental question we were trying to get at with this whole degree program is, why do farmers do what they do, and how can we use that information to alter how they work with the environment, seeing as how so much of the world is covered in agricultural land. So we had this visiting scientist come from Oaxaca, Mexico, and he studies agave production. And he told us a story about how a leg, this guy's like standing on it, and it's like, it's up to his knee. It's got this really large root structure underground, so if you wanted to go back in and then plant crops, you'd first have to go and rip out all of these roots. And so a lot of these farmers entered into these contracts to grow agave all at the same time. And during that time when the agave was being grown, they were not allowed to enter their land, they were not allowed to use the land to grow subsistence crops, so they had to find other ways of